This is the monthly recording of the Talking About Kids podcast that happens with a live audience in conjunction with the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health. And I'm joined today with Tracy Pedrotti from the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health. Hello, Tracy. And our guest today is David Riedman. And I've known David a little while now. David is the founder of the K through 12 school shooting database, which contains detailed information on all school shootings, really going back to the 1970s, which we're going to get to in a moment here. But David, I'm sorry that we continue to have to talk about this topic, but I'm certainly glad that you're out there with your database and looking at the numbers. I have to ask, and it's something that I ask all the guests, is kind of what got you interested in this topic to begin with?
Well, Brad and Tracy, thank you so much for having me today and happy to talk with your audience. This was a project that I never intended to be involved with. I really, even though I grew up in the era of being in school when Columbine occurred, being in college when Virginia Tech occurred, seeing Sandy Hook as an adolescent, I never saw my place or involvement in school shootings or gun violence at schools until I was sitting in a classroom in a postgraduate think tank program at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in 2018. And as we're talking about the next generation of homeland security threats, the future of terrorism, the future of security across our country, there are 17 kids that were killed and 17 more that were wounded at a high school in Florida. So I'm sitting there in a classroom talking about the future of homeland security when a very significant school shooting happened. And that was a topic that had never come up anywhere in any of the work that I'd done across the Homeland Security enterprise. And I wanted to understand that problem. And now, 6 years later, what started just as a casual research project has turned into the most comprehensive data source on gun violence and school property, now back to the 1960s.
Wow. Well, something that I want the listeners to understand about your database is you made some choices early on in how you were going to define the issue. Can you explain a little bit to the listeners some of those choices that you made?
I think really the big difference, the big decision that was made was how to not define the issue. And that's because there's so much rhetoric around what is a school shooting. Does it need to be deliberate? Does it need to have a certain number of victims? Does the perpetrator need to be affiliated with that school? Do they need to be an outsider? All of these different kind of boundaries are drawn around school shootings. But the least common denominator there is that a gun is fired on school property. And once a gun is fired on school property, there are many different variables that can take place. Was somebody shot or not? Were multiple people shot or not? Was there intent? Did it take place inside the building or outside the building? What were the circumstances surrounding that shooting? What was the impact of that shooting? Did it cause a lockdown? Did it cause a closure of the campus? So every one of those elements is a decision where if you say, yes, this matters, or no, this doesn't matter, you're going to cut off everything else that's down that tree of decisions. So the school shooting database is based on the least common denominator, as I said. It's any time that a gun is fired on school property, regardless of the time of day, regardless of the reason, regardless if anybody is injured. But that information is captured with hundreds of different variables so that any other researcher can narrow it down for whatever their specific question is.
I think it's such an important service that you provided by including all of that. I actually just got in a little bit of an argument about this because I was talking with a colleague and he said, well, the K through 12 database, includes shootings that happen after school. It includes things that happen on the weekends. And I said to him, he's a father of three, and I said, if your kid was going to a school and there were a lot of shootings that were happening after school and on the weekends, wouldn't that still matter to you? Even if it didn't happen in the confines of the day, wouldn't you still want to know? Wouldn't that say something to you about that school and the struggles that it's facing? and he didn't have a response to that. So I'm glad that you are having are employing this more comprehensive way of collecting the information. And of course, as you mentioned, researchers can parse it. But you said that you've gone back now into the 60s. Last time we talked, you had gone into the 70s. And when I was first asked to comment about school shooting, that was in the early 2000s. And I said, I mean, it's written, I said these events are incredibly rare. They're not new. We are not seeing an increase in them. And I even at the time was talking about how, in 1979, the Boomtown Rats wrote a song about school shootings. I don't like Mondays. That's what that song is about. And I was making the case that, we shouldn't be alarmist, but that was in the early 2000s. What are you seeing now?
There are kind of a couple different ways to think about school shootings. And I think one of the ways that's become clear is whether something is a pre-planned attack
Hmm.
or whether something is kind of a spontaneous act of gun violence. And so the planned attack, somebody has a hit list or a manifesto, or some sort of grievance, some sort of plan where they want to, you know, kill themselves and multiple other people at the school. And they usually have multiple weapons and lots of ammunition. Those deliberately planned attacks have occurred pretty much every year back to 1966 on the frequency of kind of 2 to 4 per year. What is a bit different is something I've also tracked is averted school shootings. So that's a student that had that plan, had that intent, was trying to assemble weapons, maybe had a specific date or targets picked out. And I've recorded more than 125 of those that have been averted in the past 5 years. So there is a question about whether there are more students who now have the intent to carry out those shootings than there were in the past. But the frequency that they actually happen is about the same. On the other side, on the spontaneous school shootings, this is most often a fight that escalates, and there's a kid involved who's carrying a gun. It's probably not the first day they were carrying the gun. They've probably had it every day for weeks or months or years. They didn't plan to shoot anybody that day, but when the fight started in the hallway or at dismissal, it turns into a shooting. And those incidents have increased dramatically in the past 3 years. So that's something that started to increase in 2018 and then has doubled since then. And so since students returned from COVID, the number of these spontaneous incidents on campus have dramatically increased, like 10 times higher than they were a decade ago.
And you had pointed out, you were citing some research in one of your recent posts. And by the way, I recommend that if you are concerned about this issue, that you get in touch and you follow David Riedman's posts, because he's putting out great analysis all the time. But you had pointed out, and I actually don't know the origin of the research you were citing, but that kids are carrying guns to school for the same reasons that adults are carrying guns.
That's not based on a specific paper that's been
Mm.
written. That's based more on observations and rhetoric. And what is driving changes in laws across the country to have permitless carry or have what's called constitutional carry is that people have the right to defend themselves, to protect themselves. And that's really been a change in gun policy across the country in the past decade or so, is this idea that people need to carry a gun with them everywhere they go in all types of public places for protecting themselves and their families. Now, in the past year, I see dozens of Google alerts every day trying to find the shootings that happen at schools. I was seeing lots of alerts for stories about students arrested with guns. So for the 23-24 school year, I kept track of all of the different stories about students arrested with guns and about 800 of those incidents. And I categorized them for a bunch of different variables, the same way that I do with the shootings. And in those articles, I was seeing over and over that when there was a quote from the student or a statement from police about why the student had the gun, that they were carrying it for protection. And
Hmm.
so the same thing that's being messaged kind of by the gun lobby to adults, that you need to have a gun for protection, is the same thing that teenagers are carrying guns to school because they're worried about being victimized going to school, going from school, or while they're at school. And I recorded an episode of my weekly podcast, the Back to School Shootings podcast, a couple of weeks ago with a school security director. And he said there are kids in St. Louis, Missouri, that are carrying guns on campus every single day. And the
Yeah.
primary reason they're carrying those guns is because they fear being victimized. And that's different from different time periods.
And that's actually a trend though that precedes these shootings because we saw, really starting in kind of the mid around 2010, we saw that there were all the data about school violence that was recorded in the Wire BSS. Everything was trending in the right direction, with two exceptions. So kids were, they had said that they were less likely to be assaulted at school, they were less likely to be bullied at school. These numbers were all trending in the right direction. The one measure of school safety, or the two measures that weren't, one was that they were afraid. So even though these same kids were saying, I'm not being beaten up, I'm not being assaulted, they were more afraid that they might be. And so the second measure that was going in the wrong direction and has been for a while was carrying a weapon to school. So even though the schools were looking safer following that spike that we had in the early 90s, kids were afraid for everything that you were just saying. We've got a couple of questions. Are you
And
able to
just to pause
tell?
there for a second,
Yeah,
Brad, because I think it's important to talk about what those numbers mean in the CDC's behavioral student survey. Uh,
yeah,
if you take a look at that, it's about 3% of high school students reported that they carried a gun to school at least once in the past year. If you take that
yeah,
number across the country, there's 60 million students in schools.
yeah.
About a third of them are in high school. So that averages out to about 600,000 students that are carrying a gun with them at some point to high school during the year. And I've tried to triangulate that data with a survey I did of parents and then some county and city level data where they reported the number of guns found on school property. And all of those numbers point to somewhere in that 1 to 3% of high school kids are habitual gun carriers. That's incredible. That means in 1,000 student high school, that there are 10 kids that have a gun inside that school every single day.
A gun, by the way, that they didn't procure themselves. In other words, in most of these cases, these are guns or weapons that were given to them. These were
Or
not because
stolen, yeah, or
or
taken
stolen.
from their home, which has
I
been the other big change in
Yeah,
gun policy in the past 10 years, has been there's a strong push in many states away from mandating safe and secure storage.
yeah.
And so a survey of firearm owners said that roughly half of firearm owners keep a loaded, accessible gun in their house under the belief that they need to be ready for a home invasion at any time, even though that's extraordinarily rare.
Right.
But that means that there is a gun that a kid can just take from the kitchen counter or cabinet or dresser drawer and easily take to school.
We have a couple questions from the people who are joining us live. Cassie Samson asks, "Do you know how many of the individuals who commit or attempt school shootings have a documented history of mental illness? Is that known?"
No, that's not known, but there have been a couple studies around mass shootings and documented mental illness, and there is not a strong connection. People with documented mental illness are actually more likely to be a victim of gun violence rather than commit gun violence within schools. So, I've looked at more than 3,000 incidents over the last, 60 years. Of those, about 220 are what you would consider like a deliberate attack, or what's commonly called an active shooter now. And within those, I code for whether they have documented mental illness, but that's not available in many cases, or you suspect that there's mental illness. Many cases involve somebody who's suicidal, depressed, and they want to die during their attack. Very, very few of the cases involve somebody who's paranoid, schizophrenic, suffering severe psychosis, or would have, your severe mental illness.
Of course, being able to have a documented history of mental illness or any sort of mental health needs would require that person was seeing a professional. They would have to have been that there would have to have been that intervention. And I think that, all of us think we can use a little bit of common sense here and suggest that a lot of the shootings, the ones that I know about, obviously, David, you know a lot more, there wasn't the intervention at the level of professionalism that should have been there. You wrote, a chilling analysis of the police visit to the shooter in Georgia. And you pointed out again, it was chilling. I mean, you walked through the transcript of their cameras, the police cameras, and everything that was said and all of the responses that they gave. What was the reaction to that analysis? And can you explain a little bit about what your findings were from looking at that transcript?
Well, with the Georgia school shooting and with many others that I've looked at, I think what separates kind of severe mental illness from somebody that has an unresolved trauma, and then from that trauma, they have severe depression and ultimately suicide, that they decide they want to die in a violent public manner. That's an act that doesn't just happen after a week or a month. Like most school shootings, there are signs and planning and warnings that go back for months and usually years. And that's in the case of the shooting in Georgia. The police are at his house, almost a year before that incident. And what struck me is that your frontline officers just don't have the training and skills and attention to be able to identify the warning signs that somebody might be in trouble. So in this case, there was a specific threat that was made. It was made on a video game forum. They knew from the IP address that it was directly to that house. And so somebody who's a skilled and trained investigator would first try to gather other information. They'd try to talk to other witnesses. They'd really look at those records and know exactly what was said. And then you would go to the house and try to do an interview with both the perpetrator and, in that case, his father. And the first thing that you do is separate them. You don't want to ever interview people together. And you would already have a game plan that what you want to get to. And so you're going to ask a series of questions to start kind of validating the facts that you gathered. And in this case, it would be, we know that you made these threats. Why did you make them? What's going on? And you would start kind of building this whole profile. Instead, the officers in Georgia didn't take the situation seriously at all. They conducted a very casual interview on the front porch of the house with the father there the whole time. The officers talk more than the father does. They barely let the kid talk at all. And they just don't have the skills or attention or plan or training or just the desire to take this sort of situation seriously. And I wish that it was a one-off, except that I saw exactly the same police body cam footage from Ohio just earlier this year. And it was the same thing. Police officers went to a house. They'd gotten a report from a community member that a kid was plotting a school shooting. They didn't take the interview seriously. And later on, after the FBI called, they arrested the kid at school because he was plotting an attack with an adult in another state who was going to bring the guns. So a very real situation. It was days away from happening, and we just got lucky that it didn't. There wasn't any successful intervention at the local level.
Vicky Copeland. Vicky, hello. Vicky Copeland asked if your database is available. Of course it is. And the website will be, a link to it will be in the notes for this podcast. But let me tell you what it is right now. It is the K through 12 school shooting database, and that is K12SSDB.org. You do have some guidelines for for accessing the raw data. I know I've applied to you in the past for that. But it is you do make the data available to a very wide user group.
Yeah, and
Uh,
beyond the Excel spreadsheet, which I'm happy to send to anyone that emails me with their institutional email address and says that they are going to use this for research purposes. Uh, on the website itself, there's a robust data visualization page where you can sort and filter by time period and situation and lots of other variables. There's an interactive map that can be sorted and filtered by different variables, different years, different numbers of victims. And then there's a lot of pre-made analysis. There's a news and podcasts page that has lots of in-depth articles that have been done with this data from news organizations all over the world, from The Economist to most recently a feature story by CBS News.
Excellent. The other thing, and I had used chilling to describe your analysis of the body cam footage. There's a couple other things that your analysis has pointed out that kind of seems to contradict some of the ways that schools do these active shooter drills. And given that we have in the audience a lot of educators, let's talk a little bit about that, about how the incidents that you've been able to study like differ or are problematic given how some schools are preparing.
This was the biggest surprise for me when I started this research, because I think we all have a narrative in our mind. We all have an image of what we think the school shooting is. I think a lot of that probably comes from the imagery around Columbine, and then that was reinforced by the videos that the Department of Homeland Security put out around active shooters in the late 2000s. And we have this image of this kind of faceless, scary sunglasses outsider in combat boots and a tactical vest and a trench coat, and that they are, going to slowly and methodically walk towards the school with a gun, and then they're going to get to the door and kick in the door, and they're just going to, start shooting random people. They're going to try and kill as many random people as possible. That's the image that kind of the media and pop culture has created. But back to those, 220 deliberate attacks, one of the variables that I record for every one of these incidents is what's the age of the perpetrator and what's their relationship to the school. Are they a current student? Are they a former student? Do they have no relation? Are they an adult? Are they a parent, a teacher? And when you filter for the deliberate attacks, the most common situation is that it is a current student in the school, and it is a surprise attack that starts inside of either the bathroom or a classroom during morning classes. So this is somebody who is allowed to be at the school. There's somebody who's been trained every day since kindergarten in the lockdown and active shooter procedures. If the school has any sort of security screening at the front door, this is a student who goes through that every day. So they know exactly which scanners work well or don't. They know that you can put a gun in the bushes before class starts and then just go out of the back door and get it. Or they know that, at this time, what's been the case at a lot of schools is you have robust security screening during arrival, but the people who are doing that security screening are the teachers at the school. So they need to go teach classes. So if somebody arrives with a gun right after the security checkpoint is done, they just go on to class like everyone else. What we don't have any good information about yet is at Appalachia High, how a student had an AR-15 rifle in his backpack and managed to take that on the school bus and throughout the school building and into the bathroom without anybody noticing. But back to the fantasies, it's a current student who knows the plan, knows the procedures, knows how to bypass them, and is going to start a surprise attack inside of either the bathroom or a classroom. Fortification of the exterior of the building doesn't do anything there. Having augmented security cameras doesn't do anything there because they're not in the bathroom. They're not inside the actual classrooms. And then things like a ballistic classroom door or adding ballistic film to the windows of the classroom, you're actually making a situation where now people are stuck inside this room with the school shooting, because more than half of those deliberately planned attacks start and end in the same room. And that's not something that lockdown planning or any of this school fortification and school industrial complex is built around. It's built around the fantasy of an outsider, not somebody already inside the classroom who's allowed to be there.
The other thing that you found, and that I'd like my listeners to hear, is the number of these planned attacks that also involved explosives, explosives that thankfully haven't gone off yet. They haven't used them. But to your point, if the strategy is barricade in place and they have explosives, that seems like a recipe for disaster.
Yes, there's probably one of the incidents that, I mean, my jaw doesn't hit the floor from very many of these incident reports. But there was a school shooting in Wisconsin earlier this year, and it really didn't get a lot of attention. It was described as police neutralized an active shooter very quickly. It was a 14-year-old student, and it turned out that he had an air rifle that you could buy on Amazon. And he approached the school with the air rifle, and he was shot and killed there. And that was kind of the end of the story. But a reporter in Wisconsin sent me the police records when they came out, a month or two later. And the police records detailed the kid's search history, information about what he had been posting online. And the kid described himself as addicted to school shootings, that he was obsessed with school shootings, that he wanted to be just like the Columbine school shooters, that he had even found a way to get his parents to take him to the site of a prior school shooting. And he talked about the energy of just being on that campus. And so he couldn't get his hands on a real gun. So he got this air rifle, which it looks like through some online forums he'd modified, and it was going to be able to maybe fire one real bullet. But what surprised me was all of the things that he had around him and in his backpack when he was killed. He had Molotov cocktails, he had pipe bombs, he had improvised explosives, and he had bought radiological material online. So the dirty bomb scenario that everybody was talking about after 9/11 is this scariest scenario that you have a conventional explosive and you use it to scatter radiological material. That's what this kid wanted to do. Now, fortunately, what you can buy online is just these tiny bits of radioactive rocks that you use to calibrate scientific equipment. So they're of no risk or hazard to anybody unless maybe you ate dozens of them. But
Right.
just the thought and planning that a 14-year-old kid wanted to be a school shooter, couldn't get the gun, so he got the next closest thing, and then he started assembling all these other points, because if I can set off an explosive that has radiological material, if I can throw a Molotov cocktail in the classroom. And that's what I found across these incidents, is that rarely is it just a shooting. There's
Right.
almost always an element of either an explosive, a flammable liquid, a Molotov cocktail, or one of these other elements where you do not want to be locked inside a classroom when there's a fire, chemical, or explosive.
We're almost out of time here, but I think that's a wonderful segue to this final question that also comes from one of the webinar attendees, and that is, well, what works then to actually avert these planned school shootings?
As I spoke earlier about, I did a study of 125 averted attacks. And that's unfortunately been under peer review forever, because the peer review process is just
Yeah.
so onerous that you can have the really important information to get out and it just sits in somebody's inbox for months and months and months. Of these 125 averted attacks where somebody had intent and planning and capability, more than 80% of them were stopped by a tip from a classmate, not from a formal threat assessment team, not from an anonymous reporting app, just from a classmate saying something to an adult or another person at the school. The same with my study of the 800 guns found on school property last year. The majority of those were a tip from another student that their classmate had a gun on campus. So what we need to do is encourage students to report, not to label your friends as threats, not to turn your friends into criminals, not to have zero tolerance policy where you're going to ruin your friend's life if you report them, but to have trusting pathways where if a kid knows there's a problem, either a classmate who's suicidal, depressed, or talking about an attack, or a kid who's habitually carrying a gun to school every day, that there can be a pathway for a student to give information and for that student to get help, not expelled, not arrested, to get help to identify the root cause of either why they want to hurt themselves or others, or why they think they need to carry a gun. And the second thing that needs to be combined with is safe and secure storage of every gun all the time at home. Almost every shooting at a school is committed by a kid who can't go to a gun store and buy that gun. That means that whatever gun is taken into a school was a gun that somebody didn't keep in a safe. So we need to hold parents and gun owners accountable if they allow a teenager to carry a weapon that they own.
I think that's the perfect place to end. We could keep talking about this, but I encourage everybody listening, everybody who's watching this or everybody who's attending, go to the K-12 data school shooting database, access these materials, share them with the schools in your circle, with the school with which that you work at, with the school that your kids go to, with the school that your programs serve, because I do think that in it is, to David's point, are the building blocks of a solution here. So, David, thank you so much for taking the time to come by and speak with us today.
Thank you so much, Brad, and thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
And for the rest of you, please know that our monthly webinar for next week is going to actually be on sibling violence. It's going to be a really interesting take on what is actually one of the kind of least discussed amount of violence that our teenagers experience. So that will be a good one. Tell your friends about it and look for this online wherever you hear podcasts. David, again, thank you so much.